This is the Tree of Life, Season 12, Chapter 4. In this episode, we will be elaborating on the scale of negation introduced in the last episode. To start off, in the last episode, we discussed how when the substitution time corresponding to a dissonant space created by a negated impulse is shorter, the result is a lower scale corresponding to the descending paths related to that intersection. Let me explain this again. If we are talking about an action such as walking across a room while another watches you, this is an action that may take 10 to 15 seconds, if it is a large room. The paths permitted by dissonant spaces, corresponding to the 9 levels to that intersection, will each be appreciably longer in time, due to being more convoluted than the one above. This means that a scale describes the appreciable increase in linear time corresponding to each of those increasingly convoluted paths. That scale is dependent upon the initial length of time allocated to path parsimony, that is, the least convoluted path. But it also depends upon the negation, or concealment, corresponding to the impulse which is negated in that top path. Let me give you another example. Let us suppose for a second that instead of walking across a room, you are talking to someone in a room. As part of this conversation, you make a 5-step series of hand gestures, each of which takes 1 second to complete. Now, if we imagine that the substitution time corresponding to negation is shorter, that is, path parsimony in this case is the path of your hand from step 1 to step 2, taking 1 second, this would result in an appreciably lower time scale for the convoluted paths descending from that path being the movements associated with step 2. In other words, the time it takes for you to complete the movement is one factor in the scale corresponding to any more convoluted paths caused by negation. But it is also true that the scale is more important than the original time frame. Which is to say, that the question becomes, how many times must each path be negated, along each more convoluted path, before the substitution time becomes long enough to intersect with that person on the other side of the room? Let's say, for example, that the scale is a simple multiple of 120%. Then, a 1-second hand movement must go through all 9 iterations to reach over 10 seconds, which we can hypothesize is how long prior to beginning that second movement you entered the room. This tells us that you have to go through 9 descending more convoluted paths before you reach an embedded intersection, which results in a further 9 descending paths. This means that if a substitution time is short enough, and the scale corresponding to the descending paths is flat enough, you can limit infinite recursive exchanges. This tells us a few things. It highlights the importance of 3 things to produce infinite recursive exchanges. First, the substitution time must be elongated as much as possible. This can be done through the preparatory steps in the first chapter of the complete series, or simply by delaying expression of an impulse, thus the creation of artificial scarcity. Second, the individual must be limited the relational component of self-consciousness, which undermines the concealment of impulses. Finally, we can see thus that the bodily rhythms and their corresponding impulses provide the substrate for the corresponding movements governing the 9 plates of meaning. They are the fluid through which the body's movements pass. In their negation, we see a drag coefficient, corresponding to a particular scale describing the descent of the convoluted paths of an intersection. But what is clear is that it is only once that scale becomes steep enough, through negation, concealment, that we see the infinite recursion of a 9-fold exchange. That's the end of the podcast for today.